In the ancient world, when a city fell, the war wasn't over. It had just begun for the women left behind. They weren't just collateral damage. They were the living, breathing symbols of a city's defeat. Their suffering wasn't a byproduct of war. It was a planned, deliberate, and public act designed to break more than just their bodies. It was meant to annihilate their very identity. This isn't a story you'll find in the hero myths or the grand histories of philosophy. This is the hidden history of humiliation, where the most vicious punishments weren't for soldiers, but for the wives, daughters, and mothers of the conquered. They were dragged into slavery, beaten, and paraded as spoils of war. Their dignity was the final, most satisfying prize for the victors. For them, punishment wasn't confined to a prison cell. It was a public spectacle, performed to crush the spirit as much as to break the body. The goal was to leave a scar that no physical wound could match. But what happens when the most brutal punishments are delivered not with a sword, but with an everyday item from a market stall? The radish and the fig, a grotesque symbolism. The ritual began with an object so ordinary it made the cruelty all the more chilling. A hard, knobby radish or a dried fig. This wasn't about pain alone, it was about mockery. The instrument was an improvisation, an intimate and unbearable act of public degradation. The accused woman, stripped from the waist down, had nowhere to hide. Her hands were pinned, and all eyes in the crowd narrowed to a single shameful point. A magistrate, or perhaps a resentful husband, would announce the crime: adultery, seduction, or some perceived breach of honor. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the act would begin. This wasn't a medical procedure or an execution. It was a symbolic violation, a grotesque reversal of roles. The woman accused of sexual impropriety was subjected to an enforced public indignity, turning her body into living evidence of her own shame. The physical pain was immediate and excruciating. A hard radish bruised and scraped, a dried fig when forced inside, tore the flesh and caused a hot, burning abrasion. But the physical pain was fleeting compared to the deeper wound. The longer punishment was the gnawing knowledge that her body had been turned into a stage prop for communal contempt. In some cases, the object was left in place, or even paraded and smashed to amplify the humiliation. A common food item, something one might have eaten that same morning, was now a symbol of her permanent dishonor. The once pure body was now publicly marked, spoiled, and contaminated for life. Beyond the immediate trauma, the after effects were devastating. In an age without antiseptics, the raw, injured flesh was prone to infection, leading to chronic pain and lasting scars. Socially, the act obliterated her privacy and her dignity. The woman who walked into the agora as a wife or neighbor left as a spectacle. Her family was shamed, her children's futures altered forever. In Athens, where reputation and civic standing were the only true currency, this kind of bodily degradation was an instrument of social death. But if that was the punishment for a supposed crime, what was the fate of a woman in the marketplace for something as simple as defiance? What happens when humiliation becomes a performance art? Bodiza, the agony of public exposure. The most public of all shames was the punishment known as bodiza. It didn't begin in a dark cell, but in the roaring heart of the city, the Athenian agora. This was no private chamber. It was the marketplace, a hub of merchants, philosophers, and citizens. To be dragged here, not as a free woman, but as an object of ridicule, was the ultimate degradation. The condemned woman was stripped bare, sometimes entirely, sometimes left with a ragged cloth that barely covered her. She was then bound upright against a post, her body exposed under the relentless Mediterranean sun. For a society obsessed with female modesty, public nudity was more devastating than a lash. This was not mere exposure. It was a calculated display designed to amplify her humiliation. Neighbors, traders, and even slaves would pass by, seeing her not as a person, but as a cautionary tale. Children would laugh, old men would point, some would even spit or hurl refuse. The guards would do nothing, because the punishment thrived on the crowd's participation. The physical torment was relentless. Hours under the sun burned her skin until it blistered. Without water, her mouth dried to a choking thirst. Hunger gnawed at her as weakness spread through her legs, forcing her into shameful, trembling postures she couldn't hide. Dust from the marketplace clung to her sweat, caking her body in a final layer of filth. Insects gathered, crawling freely on her wounds, eyes, and mouth. The longer she was left there, the more grotesque the spectacle became. A once respected woman, perhaps a citizen's wife, was reduced to a public warning. This is what happens when you dishonor the polis, your husband, or your gods. But the deepest wound was never physical. It was the erasure of her dignity. In Athens, a woman's value was tied to her modesty and her household reputation. Bodiza destroyed both at once. The exposure was worse than a beating, because the marks it left were invisible, a shame that followed her home, whispers that poisoned her family's honor, and a stigma that would never fade. Some endured this for hours, others for a full day. A few never returned alive, collapsing from heat stroke or simply left to die. The Athenians considered the punishment complete only when humiliation had run its course, and the example had been burned into the public memory. Bodiza was not meant to punish the body. It was crafted to destroy the spirit and turn a woman's flesh into a public message. You do not belong to yourself. You belong to the city, and the city may strip you bare at will. But what could be worse than public exposure? A punishment that didn't just strip you of your clothes, but of your very identity itself. The final cut: shaved heads and stigma. In ancient Greece, a woman's hair was more than just a part of her appearance. It was a symbol of her pride, her identity, and her femininity. To strip it away was to strip away her honor. This is why shaving heads, often combined with brutal beatings, was one of the most humiliating punishments for women. For a wife accused of adultery or a woman caught defying her guardian's authority, this punishment was designed not only to hurt, but to shame her for life. Her hair was cut off in public, leaving her bare and exposed. In a society where long hair was a sign of beauty and virtue, a shaved head marked her as permanently disgraced. It was a stigma that followed her with every glance from her neighbors. But humiliation alone wasn't enough. Beatings were added to deepen the suffering. Struck with rods, belts, or fists, her body carried the bruises, while her head carried the public stigma of dishonor. For slaves, this combination was especially common. Masters would shave their heads to distinguish them from free women, using violence to reinforce their submission. The cruelty of this punishment lay in its permanence. A physical wound could heal, but hair would take months, even years to return if it ever grew back the same. During that time, she couldn't hide her disgrace. Every time she stepped into public, her bare scalp spoke louder than words. In ancient Greece, to lose one's hair under punishment was to lose one's identity. Combined with the blows of a beating, it was a constant, brutal reminder that a woman's body did not belong to her. It belonged to her husband, her master, or the state. They could take from her not only her dignity, but the very symbols of her womanhood, leaving her with nothing but the lasting, visible scar of their anger.